Olivia is Palagi, European descent researcher and climate activist living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She works as a climate change policy and advocacy advisor at World Vision New Zealand. After having completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Auckland in 2022, her research and advocacy is action-orientated, primarily informed by community psychology and works towards tangible social and policy change. Her work centers upon the socio-structural causes of climate injustice in the Pacific, with a focus on Tuvalu and Kiribati, and also upon an appropriate settler response to climate mobility. Olivia is a member of the World Universities Network Consortium on Climate-Induced Migration, on the board of Generation Zero, a youth-led climate justice organization, and lives in Tamaki, Makuroa, Auckland, with a partner. I really apologize. I I thank everybody for your patience with my pronunciation, and the more we engage as scholars, I think that we can improve on this. So welcome, Dr. Olivia. You can say a few words before we start.
Kia ora tātou, tēnā rā tātou, no inga rangi me ko te rano o ku tupuna, kei Tamaki Makaurau, tōku kāinga anaenei, hei kairanga hau ki World Vision. So my name is Olivia. I live in Tamaki Makaurau, which is the Māori Indigenous name for Auckland, our largest but not capital city here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I have English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh ancestry, and I grew up in a city called Tauranga, which is bright and sunny and beautiful, and much warmer than where I currently am in Auckland. I do also want to say talo whakoutou, Kimna Manini Māori. Hello everyone in Tuvalu and Kiribati, and also acknowledge all of you. I had a quick search and I saw that there's 11 official languages of South Africa. So greet you all and all of your beautiful languages. And yeah, look forward to our Talanoa tonight.
Yeah. So I put in the name of an article that Dr. Olivia Yates have published. It's around restoring migration. And I think it's a really lovely introduction to Talanoa methodology. So if you would like to read a bit more about that, please do so. So the format of this particular webinar is centered around 4 main research questions. And we're hoping to enlighten scholars and academics and community members around the use of Indigenous research methodologies. So to start off today, I'd like to ask Dr. Olivia if she can maybe give us an insight into what Talanoa methodology is.
Yeah, great. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about this topic. As you may have read from the introduction to this talk, the Talanoa methodology is a Pacific method and methodology that's really just about having a conversation. But it's more than just a conversation. It's what we call an intersubjective and empathetic exchange. So it's focusing on the space between people and the empathy that we can create in that. It derives from various different Pacific languages. In Tongan, Talanoa means just talk or talk about nothing. It has similar use in Fiji and also in Samoan, but the idea of Talanoa, the style of talking, is really common across the Pacific. And so in the spirit of Talanoa, we thought that we would have this discussion today, have it a bit less structured than one would normally, as in a more structured interview. Compared to that, Talanoa is much more flexible. And so if any of you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the chat. and I will see if I can answer them on the fly as we go. I am using a small screen, so that may prove difficult, but we'll see how we go. So to talk a little bit more about Talanoa. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I myself, as a European descendant, am not someone whose worldview naturally gels with Talanoa. Talanoa is a methodology that's really deeply rooted in Pacific ways of doing and being. But because of that, because it's so anchored in Pacific ways of doing and being, it's quite a popular research method and methodology for people from all backgrounds, particularly when working with Pacific communities. And this is because it really centers Pacific worldviews in the process. And that's part of trying to make sure that Pacific people's values, cultures, languages, spiritualities are respected and honored intentionally, but also recognizing that I guess a lot of the different labels that we like to use for different methodologies can kind of sit outside of what Talanoa is trying to express. What I'm saying by that is that often in psychology, we get caught up around our particular paradigm, our particular ontology, rather than focusing on research, on creating research that actually serves a purpose that is really targeted to create change for communities who are experiencing oppression. And so Talanoa kind of sits outside alongside that, where it's not trying to impose a particular worldview or a particular paradigm, but rather it's focusing on legitimizing Pacific realities, Pacific ways of doing and being, and their social, their spiritual, their historical contexts. And all of that is really focused on furthering the interests of Pacific peoples. So you can't really have Talanoa, the method and methodology, without having specific outcomes that are going to support Pacific peoples. When I say it's both a method and a methodology, what I'm meaning there is that it serves as an overarching framework, but also a specific way of collecting data. So as a specific method, as opposed to the interview, which I mentioned earlier, or even the open and unstructured interview, Talanoa is more than an interview. It's more focused on the space between us. It's intersubjective. And it's about creating a space for dialogue between people in relationship with one another. So in that process, it's not just focusing on what people are saying, but it really tries to center uh, those who are speaking, their emotions, their behaviors, their cultures, their empathy, and kind of pays attention to what that might be saying, whether people are looking away, what they're doing with their hands, but how that is particularly anchored within different cultural practices. Uh, it's also, if we think of it as a methodology in practice, that looks like instead of coming down with a really scripted interview, you might have a few guiding questions, but generally you put the process in the participant's hand, in the speaker's hands, and that purpose is so that we can try and sort of shift this power dynamic, which is so common and so hard to escape in research, so that the way that we respond to each other is a bit more flexible. The conversation kind of goes where the participant, where the respondent wants to take it. If we think about Talanoa as an overarching methodology, that's when it kind of comes to situate Pacific ways of doing and being in context across the research process. So it's not just a one-off methodology, but it pays attention to how each of your steps chosen in the design of the research serves Pacific people's interests and benefits them, but also tries to embed Pacific values all the way across the process. And so to that end, it kind of creates a platform for ongoing dialogue between people. And That means that the interview is not just a one-off conversation, but rather the methodology itself reflects and intentionally tries to make sure that you really continue to maintain this relationship and creates meaningful dialogue. And yeah, this is in order to, again, produce culturally appropriate knowledge. And that's the kind of key word there with Talanoa. It's not just creating outputs, data that sort of fits within the classic Eurocentric paradigm, but rather reflects the knowledge that is best explained within particular cultural communities. Yeah, and the final point I wanted to add to all of that, and I realize it's probably a lot to take in all at once, is that Talanoa is really a mutual process. It's grounded in mutual respect for one another. The researcher doesn't try to separate themselves from the process, but they see themselves as someone who participates in the research, who's really there to build empathy, to create a sense of who I am and who you are. So to kind of summarize all of that, if I were to give it a label in terms of its epistemological framing, it's more of a process that is relational, that it sees knowledge as that which is created between people who are in relationship with each other.
I really like the way that you frame the need for us as researchers to actually stay beyond our normal frames. We most of the time when you're trained in psychology, you're trained. This is how you do an interview. You must have an interview guide, and you go to the participant, you collect the data, and then you leave. And that relationality isn't there, the respect isn't there, the giving back isn't there. And that I think there's something very important that you mentioned, which is that the methodology serves the purpose of the people who are participating in the study. So I think for us as researchers, when we're coming from a very global northern way of orientating our research, the Talanoa methodology facilitates us to rethink our own positionality.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I don't think that as you said at the start that this wasn't something that gelled quite naturally to yourself. So what were some of the motivation for yourself to actually use this Talanoa methodology?
Mm. Yeah, that's a question I've been asked many times. For context, I did my PhD over the course of 4 years, working really closely with the communities in Auckland from Tuvalu and Kiribati. And our research was focusing on the well-being implications and people's perspectives of climate mobility from the Pacific to Aotearoa, New Zealand, with a really explicit intention of trying to create research that filled a really massive gap at the time around what is actually happening in the space of climate mobility, what frameworks are there, and how are they impacting people's lives. And I knew from this process, from this idea rather, that uh, if this research was actually going to do what it needed to do, if it was going to inform policy in a way that creates positive benefits, then I really needed to do my homework. I needed to make sure that I was really aware of, I guess, my own positionality in the process. And we love to talk about positionality, particularly in qualitative research. And as much as I hate continuously turning and focusing back on ourselves, when we're doing research that is so intentionally relational, it's actually incredibly important. So, sort of through that process of coming to understand who I was in the research space, I understood that if I wanted to do this research topic, I would need to work with the right people. And so I approached my community psychology lecturer and also a lecturer who works on Pacific psychologies at the University of Auckland. Their names are Shiloh Groot and Sam Manuela. And actually, both of them sort of pioneered their discipline within our psychology department at the University of Auckland. And I was really honored that they actually wanted to work with me. especially as a rather naive sort of undergraduate, honours student coming into their offices, big dreams, big plans, wanting to do something about climate injustice, but having very little actual research experience, particularly designing a project from start to finish. And one of the first questions they asked me was, why you? Why this project? And while it was like quite confronting, it sort of set me up for the rest of this research project, because that was ultimately the question that shaped everything. What am I bringing into the space that means that I'm choosing this research question? And what structures can I put in place to make sure that this particular question actually serves what we're hoping to do, which is ultimately to create something that's not just a product, but adds a bit more life, a bit more reality into what's going on for people from Tuvalu and Kiribati. And I looked at a kind of a range of different Pacific methods and methodologies. But because I myself am not a Pacific person, I didn't feel like I was competent in using many of the other ones. Um, yeah, there's a wide array of Pacific methodologies, and all of them tend to be anchored in a particular culture. Talanoa, while it's anchored in primarily Tongan culture, because that's just where there's the most literature, it has been widely applied across the Pacific and sort of is known to be quite flexible for people who don't have a lot of experience in its use. It's also a methodology that, while it does have the particular method within it of the way that we converse with each other, it doesn't really prescribe how you go about your analysis, which means that I was able to sort of look around and see what would be the best fit for the project. And so, yeah, sort of being guided by Pacific values that led me to Talanoa. There's some really great resources that are available in Aotearoa in New Zealand for research with Pacific peoples. And yeah, a couple of those papers, which I'm happy to share at the end of this, were quite pivotal in leaning me towards Talanoa. Excuse me. In particular, there's a Pacific Health Research Guideline document that's very meaty, but goes through in detail about how important it is that the values of the Pacific in general, noting that there is kind of differences between different countries and different islands and communities within those countries. There's sort of a broad resonance of the importance of interdependence and relationality, reciprocity, and holism in particular, not trying to see the self as separate from someone else and separate from the environment and separate from our history, but see it all as interconnected. And so I tried to look for a method that sort of fit that framework, the importance of values, but also was something that, as someone with not a lot of experience yet in that space, I was able to apply with the support of my supervisors. The other thing I want to add to that is that I had come from a community psychology tradition, and so I was very committed to action research, trying to not only achieve transformative policy outcomes or outcomes for communities through research, but also to kind of take the community psychology lens of looking at thoughts, feelings, behaviors in their contexts, but also with the more critical lens from the sort of social level, from the political analysis level. And all of that seemed to fit quite well within Talanoa because of its really explicit goal of supporting Pacific peoples. Trying to work towards transformative change kind of fit really well within that. And then, yeah, the final point I wanted to add as to why I chose Talanoa is that, yeah, a lot of Eurocentric hegemonic psychology tries to separate ourselves from our social worlds. And if we're thinking about climate change in the Pacific, you can't really examine the well-being impacts of climate change if you don't look at that really critical relationship between people and land. And so using a framework, a worldview that didn't see land as something that had a spirit or a force or something that was considered as impacting on one's well-being wouldn't have worked. So then I kind of shifted and, yeah, focused on a paradigm that's less exploitative, that's really trying to work with people on their level and avoids this industrialized, individualized way of looking at the self and thinks more about the self in context, allows researchers to be flexible, to sort of move within people's social and cultural worlds, and kind of situating people's experiences within the broader context. Yeah, so it came together quite well, all guided by, I guess it's like our guiding star of, we want this to be useful. We want this to actually contribute to creating change.
I think that what you said is really insightful, and I really appreciate your ability to really to reflect back on who you are and why you want to do this, and the fact that you had a very strong community psychology orientation, and so I think that where climate psychology is moving towards is that acknowledgement that we as human beings we are part of the earth, and it's when we separated ourselves from the earth is when a lot of the problems around climate change and climate injustice started coming about. So I think it's really necessary for us to rethink the individualistic component of psychology and its impact on how we theorize about climate change in general.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things at the time for my work was that there were very few studies that looked at climate change in the Pacific from this more holistic lens. While the scene is very different now, it's been, what, 7 years since we first came up with the research design. Uh, back in 2018, when we were beginning the project, there was only really one paper that I found that examined the impacts of climate change and migration by considering all parts of life. And so, yeah, that was a really clear tell for me that our research needed to kind of follow what they had done, which was use the Talanoa methodology and then try and kind of expand upon that. Yeah.
So um, I wanted to find out from you, when you're using Talanoa methodology, are there any particular knowledge, skills, attitudes, or ethical considerations that you think is necessary for a researcher to have or begin to think about when they want to use this type of methodology?
Mm, mm. Yeah. I mean, the primary thing is that I guess the researcher needs to understand the purpose of Talanoa and the kind of crux of it, of trying to validate and respect Pacific cultures in order to create culturally relevant research. Um, and so I think, yeah, some of the necessary skills for a researcher would be, first of all, feeling like they had a relatively good grasp on the communities, the cultures they were working with. That's one of the first steps for me, which was kind of doing a deep dive into Tuvalu and Kiribati cultures, languages, histories, and even the structure of their communities here in Auckland, so that, I guess, extending from Pacific values, I could come into the space from a place of respect and kind of know who the right people were in the room to acknowledge. So yeah, the first thing there is you've got to feel at some degree competent and engaging with the cultures or the communities that you're working with. Following on from that, the researcher also needs to basically be trusted, to be trustworthy, have a relatively established ability to do qualitative research to a good quality, just because, I guess, similar with a semi-structured interview, just because it's more flexible and more free does not mean that anything goes. It means actually the opposite, that it takes more skill. And I don't claim to have achieved that in the slightest. I think that, yeah, even the most expert researchers probably still feel like there's more room to go, and I'm nowhere near an expert researcher. Yeah. So I think it's important to sort of understand the limitations of your knowledge as well. Relatedly, it's important to consider how Talanoa might fit alongside other Pacific or Indigenous methodologies. Uh, So there are, across the Pacific, there's a really wide range of methodologies that have been created, and some of them are just methods, and some of them are processes for analyzing data, and some of them give a sort of wider paradigmatic view. For example, there's Whaleatui, which is, it translates to sort of weaving together the houses of knowledge. And I think that's a Samoan methodology, but that's not something that I would have felt confident doing. Or we have, there's tui kakala, which is a process of weaving. It lands upon the metaphor of the garland, and sort of as the way the flowers are woven together. So the data would be woven together to tell a story. So there are lots of methodologies like that, a lot of which tend to lean upon metaphor or symbolism to convey what they're going for. So a researcher would need to be aware of whether there's a Pacific methodology that actually might be more appropriate. And if it is more appropriate, are they competent at using it? For Tuvalu, at the time, there might have been changed now, but at the time there were no methodologies that had been created specific to Tuvaluan ways of doing and being. And neither had there been for Kiribati. And so I took an approach which, that paper I mentioned earlier, the first one that I found that connected well-being to its broader context, yeah, I kind of worked with Talanoa, but understanding Talanoa within their languages and within their cultures. So the word Talanoa itself does not originate from Tuvalu or Kiribati, while they understand what it means, largely because the word Talanoa has been spread across the Pacific to mean a storying space. Yeah, they do have their own words. In Tuvaluan, you have Sautalanga or Sautalanga, which is a discussion, a conversation. It's more flexible, but it is intentional. It's about talking about a serious topic. In Kiribati, you have Te Meroro, which again is a free-flowing conversation, but it's really grounded in Kiribati ways of conversing. Yeah, so that point there, make sure that the method is right for the culture, and if there's a more appropriate one, use that. I think another skill that would be necessary is, and I think this applies to a lot of Pacific methodologies, is yes, it would be that it's important to also really focus on that positionality element all the way across the research process, intentionally be reflexive. And that's not just for researchers who come from outside the communities that they're working with, but even for those that consider themselves to be part of the community. We all know that it's important to balance this insider-outsider dynamic. Are you one of us or are you not? But also to recognize that Pacific methodologies are really relational. And so if we focus on this like self and other boundary, we can get really separated in the way that we engage. And so reflexivity comes in as a way to sort of bridge that gap, where it creates a possibility for us to weave together, I guess, our differences. I would often reflect upon, well, my worldview means that I'm seeing things this way, but I think that's an assumption. And I got into the habit of every time after I met with someone, whether informally or formally, kind of get out my phone and do a voice recording, and I'd start with asking myself the same questions like, okay, so what was the impact I had on them? What was the impact they had on me? What did I assume to be happening? What else could have been happening? And it was quite confronting at the start to try and step outside of myself. But towards the end, it allowed me to see, even in conversation with people who I might now consider friends, that yes, we come from different places when we approach this topic, but ultimately we're both in solidarity together, working towards a more climate just future. I feel like the list of different things to be aware of could go on forever, but I will just raise a few more points and bear with me, please. It is a really time intensive and cost intensive way of doing research. As a story, I am connected to a group of researchers from the University of Auckland who are doing some work with the New Zealand government on climate mobility. And the New Zealand government put out for tender, and essentially they were wanting people to propose different projects, but they wanted it to be quite Pacific centric. And without going into too much detail about that process, essentially there ended up being a bit of tension between those that were hiring the researchers and those that were proposing the research, because the government didn't want to basically provide all of the funding that would support the project to be fully integrated into Pacific ways of doing and being. And that's because the relational component is so important. It's not just I email you, we sit down, that's it. But rather, we email, we get to know each other, we build a sense of trust. And then we might sit down, and then there's the follow-up conversation. And a lot of these aren't unique to Talanoa or Pacific methodologies, but it really comes back to making sure you have that level of connection and comfort that allows you to go deeper in these conversations. I remember when I was learning about Talanoa in community psychology, I was told a story of a researcher who was working with Samoan women and their experiences of depression. And she was explaining that for her, Talanoa might mean going over to somebody's house and sitting down, and she's doing the dishes, and you're drinking a cup of tea, and then you get up and you help her do the dishes, and maybe for an hour you're just standing there chatting, drinking tea, eating biscuits, doing the dishes, and then maybe at some point the person doing the dishes might bring the conversation round and say, hey, it's time, or oh, so you've come to talk about this, or yeah. And so in that way, the researcher has to really be open to being flexible, to understanding that by handing over as much as you can, the power to those you're in conversation with, you do have to let go. The conversation might go on for a really, really long time. It might go in directions you don't expect, but it comes back to valuing the participant and what they are saying, trusting that, or maybe they're diverting it because they don't want to talk about it, or maybe this other topic is actually more important to them. A story related to that is that when I began this research process, I really wanted to focus on mental health. But some of the very first conversations I had with the Tuvalu community were not focusing on climate change and mental health, but rather how prevalent it is for community members to struggle with the immigration system, and how all of these barriers in the immigration system are creating these downstream impacts on their well-being. Some people have been trying to get visas for years and years and years, but haven't been able to because the system is so built around this understanding of skills being those which you can contribute to the workforce. It doesn't take into account climate change risk or other sort of non-economic skills. And this was something I had never really considered. I hadn't thought about the possibility of irregular migrants because of New Zealand's immigration system. But right from those early conversations, when I was sort of like handing over the direction of the conversation, uh, it allowed us to bring out a lot more depth and richness to the process. That said, there can be caveats to that. Sometimes the conversation can go in a direction you really don't want it to go. And that can mean that not only is it a lot of your time, but for other people in the room, if you're doing a kind of focus group style, group Talanoa session, it can redirect all of their time and energies as well. There's also I guess, I don't know if it's a caveat or just something to be conscious of, that it's because of the intentional focus on Pacific cultures, one of which is respect for seniority. Often the person who has the most respected position can sort of start to control the conversation and talk about this particular topic for a long time. That can be both beneficial and detrimental. Beneficial because if you're having a conversation with someone who's highly respected, everybody trusts their knowledge and what they have to say. But it can be detrimental because others feel like they can't speak up because they have to respect and honor what this person has said. And this would be different across different Pacific cultures according to their particular ways of doing and being. I did find, just thinking along advantages here, one of I guess skills, I don't know if it's really a skill to be aware of, but thinking more about values about relationship. I found that over the course of the research project, by opening up the conversation to be more fluid and actually starting with a check-in question, not just jumping straight into, let's talk about climate change, but rather like, tell me about yourself. Where are you from? And then not only that, but offering things about yourself. At the beginning, you weave together this space, this relational space, which in the Pacific is called the va. And once you've established this connection, then it allows the research to go deeper. The kind of flip side of that, I guess the skill side, is that, if you're not familiar with the way of engaging, or if you're not, I guess, competent with the way of engaging, it can mean that the communities you're working with can close down or give sort of one-word answers, things without a focus or direction. And so as a consequence, it can be hard to get the information that either you were looking for in your research question or that others had told you they wanted to share. An example of that from my research is I had a group conversation with a group of young Kiribati women, and one of them was really shy right from the beginning. I sort of kept trying to be like, and do you have anything to say? Would you like to add anything to that? And she just stayed silent the whole time. And a lot of that might have been because I was an outsider. I was a Palangi woman, didn't have a connection with her, didn't speak the language. A lot of it also could have been that she didn't feel competent speaking in English, and so maybe there was a shame element. But all of that comes back to the importance of knowing the culture, knowing what the body language might mean, speaking the language, which of course is not easy if you're not from that community. And I've learned a lot throughout this research process. I am still connected to the communities that I worked with and hope to continue to be. But yes, by no means do I feel yet at the level where I can sort of understand all of the different cultural nuances. And the final thing I would say is, I guess, thinking about how you develop research that you're sure is useful. And I keep saying useful, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is valid for the end goal that you are trying to achieve. There are a lot of different validity measures within qualitative research. And a lot of those validity measures are sort of a backlash response to quantitative validity measures, which focus on generalization or reliability. And Violette, who was or is a Tongan author who founded Talanoa methodology in its original form, he talks about how just because it's flexible doesn't mean that you can't trust it. But he really stresses the importance of trust, and that the Talanoa that you have has to be trusted both by the participants, by yourself, and by the wider society. So are the participants acting like they're trusting you? Are they sharing in a way that means you have a connection? Uh, do you feel like you can trust the conversation yourself? Do they feel like they're lying? Are they being genuine? Can you trust who you're being in that space? And then the trustworthiness of the outputs might look like the engagement or uptake from the public or from your targets to the research. Maybe a particular ministry is interested in it, maybe a particular community want the findings. So it might be considered trustworthy then, according to Violette, if it really is used by those who have the most interest or need for the research. That was a lot of information there, and I'm aware we're coming close to time, so I might end there. Back over to you, Fatima.
So I just wanted to reflect on 2 points that you made. And the first one is the need for flexibility for the researcher, that you might have a particular interest when you're going into the community. However, when you get there and you're establishing the relationships and you actually listening to what people are saying and you engaging with people, you do need to have the flexibility to realize, but what you think is a problem might not be the problem that people perceive they to be. So you do need to be courageous as a researcher. And so that sense of flexibility and trust is something that isn't established overnight. And so yes, one of the important things when doing qualitative research from a community psychology lens, research into indigenous spaces, I think the need for that relationality and that respect needs to be put into the timeline. So, in as much as Talanoa methodology might take longer, the possible outcomes and action points is quite relevant for the community. And so that is very important to keep that in mind when you are doing any form of research, that there needs to be something that you want to do with what you have from your research. So that's at least what I got. So yeah, that's some of the thing. I really liked your reflexivity, that the questions you were asking yourself after each engagement that you had with the participants. I thought that's actually a very grounded way to think back what happened, what did I do, how did I engage with this person, to think through all those nuances. And I think, you know, but you had courage to do this research, and I think we all need to be courageous if we are to do something different with the research. Research can't just be you write a paper and it goes on a shelf. There's thousands and thousands of dollars and rands going into this research, so you want the research to have utility and action. So yeah, I think this was a really beautiful conversation. I really appreciate your time. Just to
I might just add something onto that before you open for questions around relationality. One of the core things that came to shape my research at the end of the process, but I realized it had been there the whole time, was the concept of the va, the sacred relational space that's common across specific cultures. And that's the idea of the va, is that kind of pivotal in any conversation is respecting the space of relationships, which is called to leva, to nurture, to care for, protect. And so if we nurture the relationship, if we sort of pay attention to it, make sure that we're tidying any disagreements, that we're focusing on mutual benefit, then it sort of deepens the relationship. And that more broadly links into something that really came to ground the process at the end around relational ethics rather than the tick box exercise of institutional ethics, thinking more about the relationship, the quality of the relationship that you have, and making sure that it is mutually respectful and mutually beneficial. Yeah, and yeah, happy to share some references and recommended reading list as I see from the questions there.
Yes, we definitely should share that. So, just was checking in our comments. So Leonie said that uh, Tika Makia, give me just 1 minute. I acknowledge your hand. Let me just quickly get through the questions. A great way to position yourself in your research from the get-go. Why this research? Moving from extraction to collaboration to co-creation and contribution must be at the heart of what we do as researchers. And then another comment is excellent insights and a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Olivia and Fatima. Can you provide recommended readings? We will do so in a few minutes. We just want to get through some of the questions, and we have one hand. Also love the reflexivity questions after each session to make your thoughts tangible and engage in critical thinking. So yes, that diary, reflexivity diary, is quite a useful tool. So you definitely should keep that. Tico, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for that presentation as well. Very comprehensive, and I did enjoy it. My concern, and perhaps I'll take you back to 2018 when the Talanoa dialogue became, in fact, it took center stage, if I can put it that way. And the African climate talk in that response to the, in fact, the report is titled Contributions to the Talanoa Dialogue. So they highlighted a number of shortcomings with the then Paris Agreement. And one of them is the marginalization of African endogenous knowledge systems and the so-called adoption of a Western-centric approach. So my question to you then is Talanoa, which clearly is a Pacific-centric approach or methodology, is it relevant for Africa? My second, perhaps soliciting a comment from you as well, could you comment on the advocacy for context-specific approach, drawing, of course, on best practices globally, but a context-specific approach in dealing with climate change? And my last one, to give room for other colleagues, in your research so far, have you come across any African terminology concept that is closely related to the Talanoa concept or ideology? And if so, where could that be? It could be a good read for me as well. Thank you. Thank you, Fatima, for the opportunity. I would yield back to you.
Beautiful. Thank you for that question, or questions rather. Yeah, really juicy stuff to get into there. Your first point around, I guess, the Pacific methodology of Talanoa and whether it's applicable in Africa. I would say there that because it is so intentionally Pacific-centric, it wouldn't be appropriate to use in African contexts. But it could be used as a broader framework for creating a new or a novel African methodology particular to an Indigenous community or a particular cultural group that follows the broad guidelines of Talanoa if that is what resonates within that cultural community. Yeah. And there's similarities between many different Indigenous cultures, but not to the point where I feel like Talanoa could be easily translated without doing a bit of really intentional work about localizing it within one culture, one space. Yeah, your next question around the advocacy for context-specific approach when dealing with climate change. Can I just clarify there? Is your question around like why is it important to include context in climate change research? Is that correct?
Well, it's just to get your opinion on that as the way forward, really, in addressing this issue of climate change, holistically speaking.
Yeah, right. I understand. I mean, short answer, yes. I think that we can't address climate change without considering context. If you take, I mean, I'm not super familiar with the South African context, but if we examine, Aotearoa and New Zealand's broader context about how we relate to the Pacific, New Zealanders love to call ourselves neighbours to the Pacific. If we think the context there of, yes, we're bordering the Pacific Ocean, but also we are really interconnected through relational genealogies between different Pacific cultures. Māori are related to Polynesian peoples, and also our histories are bound together through processes of colonization, which saw phosphate that was mined out of some Pacific islands sent to New Zealand to then support fertilizer of agriculture, which is New Zealand's main emission profile. Methane emissions from farming in New Zealand contribute, I think, 47% of our total emissions profile. And if we just try to reduce emissions through cutting back on farming, for example, whilst also acting on climate mobility, perhaps creating a visa or something, then we might be missing that really pivotal context link, which is that, well, actually, Pacific soils are already here, they're already on this land. And it's because of this extractive process that we're so reliant on agriculture now. So that's just one example about why I think that, turning to context, understanding past history, relationships between people, different dynamics, is really critical for moving forward. And then there's a Māori proverb, which is basically to say that we walk backwards into the future. The essence of that is that we move forward by making sure we pay attention to where we've come from in the past. Yeah. And I believe there was a third point to your question, but I could not recall what it was. Is there anything else you wanted me to answer there?
Yeah, just in your readings, have you come across, well, I guess I was pulling you more towards Africa, but from other regions where there's a close correlatives to the Talanoa concept that one can perhaps compare, and to what extent they really achieve that desired goal? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar of any specific references or specific context in which a similar concept of Talanoa has been created in the African literature. I admit that's a gap in my knowledge as well. A lot of my research and methodology focuses on Pacific and Māori sort of contexts. But from conversations I have had with Fatima, she has told me that there's sort of a growing move towards creating African methodologies that, don't sort of further marginalize African researchers, as you touched on, but make sure that there's a central place for African cultures, African peoples in the research process. Yeah.
Right. So that brings us to the 11 o'clock timeline. If anybody has any burning questions, we will take one more question if it is burning. So you can raise your hand. Caroline, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Fatima. I was thinking about Diko's question about anything similar within our African setting. And the closest that I can think of very quickly is sense of place research, where you do historical walks and talks with people and walk through cultural heritage. I know Provera. Oh my goodness. I'm struggling to remember. Ruiz. Vera Ruiz has done some research on this. But it would be absolutely incredible to really take a deep dive into this. And thank you, Olivia, for an excellent presentation. It was fun to engage in a conversational um, technique throughout this presentation as well. No slides, just people talking and really connecting deeply with you. So thank you for the alternative approach. And yeah, it's going to be, I'm also interested in seeing how applicable it is to African settings in the research settings where we work. But again, the absolute gem of information that you just highlighted is always customize and always really deeply think about the directions where you're going and make sure that it's truly appropriate and applicable. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah, also just on that note of the reference you talked about, I would also be interested in reading that with my NGO hat on. I currently work for World Vision as a researcher and in the advocacy team. And yeah, not myself, but those in our programming teams do a lot of baseline assessments, assessing the efficacy of different programs. And I'm really curious about how African methodologies might be more integrated into how we do that. Yeah.
Okay. So that brings us to the close for today's webinar. I'd like to say thank you so much, Dr. Olivia Yates. You were amazing as usual. Thank you to our chair, who was with us on call today, Dr. Leonie Forrester. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for all the attendees, and your contribution. We can only do things better in the future, and I think maybe a going away message for today is if everything is built on respect and relationships, I think we can go a long way. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Great summary. Well, lovely to connect with you all. It's really refreshing for me to be talking with people outside of our context. So wonderful to hear a little bit more from yourselves as well. And all the best for your day. Yes, it's bedtime for me. It's very dark outside, so but thank you for joining. It's great to see so many people online.
Bye.
Bye.